On Sunday, July 14, 2012, Laura Babcock was reported missing by an ex-boyfriend who became concerned when he could no longer reach her.
There are some murder cases where the violence is obvious: blood, weapons, a body left behind. And then there are cases where the terrifying part is how little remains. In the summer of 2012, a 23-year-old woman named Laura Babcock disappeared from Toronto. No one saw her die. There was no reported struggle, no crime scene, no forensic discovery that immediately pointed investigators toward murder. For nearly a year, the case drifted in the direction many missing persons cases drift, quietly, without answers. But somewhere outside the city, on a rural property in Heir, Ontario, a wealthy aviation heir had recently purchased something unusual: a massive commercial animal incinerator, a machine capable of reducing a 250-pound carcass to ash. Its name was the Eliminator. And long before investigators understood why it mattered, the man who purchased it had already written the motive down himself. In a text message to his girlfriend, speaking about Laura Babcock, he wrote, "First, I'm going to hurt her. Then I'll make her leave. I will remove her from our lives." At the time, it sounded cruel, possessive, maybe even theatrical. Later, it would sound like a blueprint, because what investigators would eventually uncover was not just a murder. It was a methodical attempt to erase a human being so completely that it would appear she had never existed at all. And this is the open file. Before she became the center of one of Canada's most disturbing murder cases, Laura Babcock was the kind of person people remembered instantly.
What we know of Laura is that she was full of whimsy. Anybody that talks about her just talks about what a ball of energy she was.
Not because she was quiet, because she wasn't. Friends described her as emotional, funny, energetic, dramatic in the harmless way young people sometimes are when they feel everything intensely. She talked constantly, called people constantly, wanted connection constantly. Her father would later describe her with 2 words: whimsy and fun. She loved old rock music, reality television, acting, dancing. She carried herself with the kind of optimism that can seem almost fragile in hindsight, because the future she imagined for herself was so much larger than the life she was currently living. Laura graduated from the University of Toronto with a degree in English and drama. She wanted Hollywood, not casually, not as a fantasy people joke about. She genuinely believed she could build a creative life for herself. She talked about opening a school someday where she could teach acting and dance. But by 2012, parts of her life had become unstable. Court records later revealed years of depression and anxiety, hospital visits, self-harm, periods where her emotional state spiraled hard enough that the people around her worried about her safety. At the same time, she had stopped really living anywhere permanently. After tension at home over curfews and lifestyle choices, Laura drifted between couches, temporary arrangements, hotel rooms, friends willing to let her stay for a few days. Always carrying bags, always trying to figure out the next step. At one point during the summer of 2012, she briefly worked for an escort agency. Several clients later testified at trial. One offered to help her get an apartment. Another let her stay at his home for a period of time. People looking at the case later would try to flatten Laura into categories: a troubled young woman, a missing person, a victim. But the people who knew her kept repeating the same thing. She still talked about the future. She still made plans. She still believed things were going to improve. And that detail mattered later, because after Laura vanished, one of the central questions became whether she had simply disappeared voluntarily. But the people closest to her never believed that. Not for a second, because Laura Babcock was the kind of person who called people 20 times a day.
She was the type of friend that would call you 20 times a day, just because she wanted to be in touch. She was glued to her phone, but she had so many friends. She was full of life. She was the life of the party.
Then suddenly, nothing. No texts, no calls, no online activity, no explanation. It was as if someone had reached into her life and cut the line cleanly. If Laura's life in 2012 felt unstable, Dellen Millard's looked almost surgically controlled. He was born into wealth most people never come close to touching. Private aviation, aircraft hangars, luxury homes, expensive vehicles, large rural properties. His family owned Millard Air, a successful aviation company built over generations. From an early age, Dellen was treated like someone exceptional. At just 14 years old, he became the youngest person to solo both a helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft on the same day. Newspapers covered it. Adults praised him. The story fit perfectly into the mythology wealthy families sometimes build around their heirs. Gifted, brilliant, different. But by his 20s, the image surrounding him had started to darken. People who knew him later described someone detached, controlling, manipulative. A person who seemed to enjoy power simply because he could exercise it. He organized late-night thefts almost recreationally. Construction equipment, vehicles, random property. Not because he needed money, because he enjoyed the experience. One witness later described them as missions. There was something deeply unsettling about that detail, because it suggested boredom more than desperation. And orbiting around Dellen was another man named Mark Smich. Smich came from a completely different background: middle class, drug dealing, small criminal history, odd jobs. But the relationship between the two men fascinated people who knew them. One friend summarized it bluntly: Mark worshipped Dell, and the imbalance between them mattered, because over time, investigators would begin to believe that whatever Dellen wanted to do, Mark Smich was willing to help carry out, even when those things became horrifying. Laura Babcock met Dellen Millard years earlier. They dated briefly, but the relationship never fully disappeared. Even after things ended romantically, they stayed connected. They still talked, still crossed paths, still drifted back into each other's lives. And by 2012, that connection had become a problem for someone else. Christina Nudger, Dellen's girlfriend. The tension between Laura and Christina started in the immature way jealousy often does. Passive-aggressive texts, petty comments, competition over attention. But underneath the surface was something more dangerous. Laura represented unpredictability. She was still emotionally attached to Dellen in some form, still calling him, still present, still refusing to disappear quietly from his life. And Dellen increasingly framed her existence like an obstacle that needed to be managed. One exchange in particular would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. During an argument about Laura, Dellen texted Christina, "First, I'm going to hurt her. Then I'll make her leave. I will remove her from our lives." Not distance himself, not cut contact. Remove her. And what makes the message disturbing isn't just the threat, it's how calm it sounds. Like someone discussing logistics. At the time, no one reading those texts understood what was coming. But investigators later realized something deeply unsettling. around the same time those messages were being sent, Dellen Millard had already started preparing in ways nobody around him recognized. Because on June 18, 2012, he ordered an industrial animal incinerator, the Eliminator. The machine was massive, trailer-mounted, commercial grade, built to burn large animal carcasses down to ash. It was not the kind of purchase someone makes impulsively. And later, when investigators reconstructed the timeline, the dates became impossible to ignore. June 18, 2012. The Eliminator is ordered. Early July 2012. Laura Babcock disappears. July 5th, 2012. The Eliminator arrives at Dellen Millard's farm in Heir. The sequence felt less like coincidence and more like preparation. At the time, though, nobody knew any of this. To Laura's friends and family, she was simply becoming harder and harder to reach. Her ex-boyfriend Sean Lerner grew increasingly concerned. He began looking through phone records himself, trying to reconstruct the final days before Laura vanished. And one detail immediately stood out. Repeated calls to Dellen Millard, 8 of them. Lerner later confronted Millard directly. At first, Millard denied there had been that many calls. Then, after being shown the records, he changed his story. He claimed Laura was looking for drugs or a place to stay. The explanation sounded dismissive, detached, almost rehearsed. But by then, Laura was already gone. Police initially treated the case as a standard missing persons investigation. And in fairness, they were dealing with limited information. Laura's life appeared unstable. She moved frequently. She struggled with mental health. There was no body, no direct evidence of violence, so the case stalled. Weeks became months. And during that silence, something terrifying was happening in the background. Because Dellen Millard and Mark Smeech were not becoming less dangerous. They were escalating. On May 6, 2013, a 32-year-old husband and father named Tim Bosma posted an online listing for his truck. That simple decision would eventually expose everything. 2 men contacted him about a test drive. Dellen Millard and Mark Smeech. Bosma left with them and never came home. But unlike Laura's disappearance, this investigation moved quickly. There was a clear starting point: a vehicle, witnesses, phone records. Within days, investigators identified Dellen Millard. Then they found Tim Bosma's truck hidden in a trailer connected to Millard. And when police searched the farm in Heir, they discovered something that instantly changed the scale of the investigation: the Eliminator. Inside the incinerator, investigators located burned human remains belonging to Tim Bosma. Suddenly, the machine no longer looked strange. It looked essential. And for the people who had spent nearly a year trying to convince police to look harder at Laura Babcock's disappearance, the realization was horrifying, because the same men connected to Tim Bosma were the last known people connected to Laura, and the same incinerator used to destroy Bosma's remains had already been sitting on Millard's property when Laura vanished. The moment investigators connected those timelines, the entire Laura Babcock case changed. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was how much evidence Dellen Millard and Mark Smeech left behind. Not physical evidence, digital evidence, text messages, photos, videos, fragments. Investigators recovered conversations between Millard and Smeech, discussing the incinerator. In one message, Millard wrote, "BBQ has run its warm-up. It's ready for meat." The message sounded grotesque enough on its own. Then investigators discovered a photograph. Mark Smeech standing in front of the Eliminator while flames blasted from the smokestack. He was smiling. as if the moment itself felt exciting. But the most disturbing discovery came from Laura's own iPad. Police eventually found it in Smike's possession, and on the device was a video, a rap performance recorded by Smidge. The lyrics referenced a woman becoming Ash. At trial, prosecutors treated the video almost like a confession hidden inside performance. Not literal, not direct, but psychologically revealing in a way that became impossible to ignore once the larger picture emerged. By this point, investigators believed they understood what happened. Laura had likely been lured to Dellen Millard's home in early July 2012. Somewhere after that, she was killed. Then, weeks later, her body was burned inside the eliminator. And the reason no one had found her was because there was almost nothing left to find. But there was another death connected to Dellen Millard. One investigators had already looked at once before. On November 29, 2012, Dellen's father, Wayne Millard, was found dead from a gunshot wound. Initially, the death was ruled a suicide, and in isolation, it appeared plausible. Wayne was alone. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. The scene looked straightforward, but after the Bosma investigation exploded open, police re-examined the death, and suddenly details that once seemed ordinary began looking deeply suspicious. Cell phone records, timeline inconsistencies, the firearm itself. Investigators eventually concluded Wayne Millard had been murdered by his own son. The realization changed the public perception of Dellen completely. This was no longer a wealthy man connected to a single horrifying crime. Investigators now believed they were looking at someone capable of repeatedly eliminating people who had become inconvenient. And when viewed through that lens, Laura Babcock's disappearance stopped looking mysterious. It started looking systematic. The prosecution faced an enormous problem. How do you convict someone of murder when there is no body, no direct forensic scene, no eyewitness, no confession? The answer was to build the case piece by piece. A mountain of circumstantial evidence, the threatening text messages, the timeline of the incinerator purchase, Laura's disappearance, the cell phone data, the digital evidence, the iPad, the photos, the Bosma murder, the incinerator itself. Individually, each piece explained very little. Together, they formed something difficult to escape. During the proceedings, Dellen Millard chose to represent himself, which created moments that felt surreal. Laura Babcock's father sitting in court while the man accused of murdering his daughter cross-examined witnesses personally. Millard argued Laura may have run away, or overdosed, or disappeared voluntarily. But prosecutors focused on one central point. Laura vanished completely, not partially, not inconsistently, completely. For someone as socially active and emotionally connected as Laura, the silence itself became evidence. No contact with friends, no contact with family, no trace of the future she constantly talked about. The prosecution argued that silence had not occurred naturally, it had been created. In December 2017, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both Dellen Millard and Mark Smythe for the first-degree murder of Laura Babcock. Later, Dellen Millard would also be convicted of murdering his father. 3 murders, 3 convictions, and still no body for Laura Babcock. Laura Babcock's remains have never been recovered, and that absence continues to haunt the case, because in some ways, the horror of what happened to her is tied directly to what investigators believe Dellen Millard was trying to accomplish. Not simply murder, erasure, a complete removal of evidence, a complete removal of identity, a complete removal of a person from the physical world, But the plan failed in one critical way. Laura Babcock was not erased. The text messages survived. The digital trail survived. The people who loved her survived. And so did the memory of who she actually was before the headlines. A young woman obsessed with acting. Someone who carried a little dog from place to place while trying to stabilize her life. Someone who still talked constantly about the future, even while everything around her felt uncertain. That version of Laura survived too. And in the end, that may be the part Dellen Millard never understood. Destroying a body is not the same thing as destroying a person. Because sometimes what remains after a crime is not physical evidence. Sometimes what remains is weight, and this case still carries it.